All 4 decal types, simple, subset, panel, and info, can be created by baking from geometry. For simple, subset and panel decals, I'd recommend to always start from a plain object. This ensures 2 things. First, it covers the entire texture area of the decal you create, so there's geometry to bake from everywhere. And second, it puts the object origin at surface level, which is important for the height map. I'm creating a very simple decal example here. Just insetting and extruding a face downwards. You could extrude upwards as well, but the parallax effect will work better if you extrude down. It's a good idea to use symmetrize, if your design allows for it, because with the edge loops in the center, you can remove the edges in the corner. I'd also recommend to always add a bevel to your hard edges, otherwise you won't get a highlight on them. Notice how I kept as small a gap as possible to the outside. This ensures no texture space goes to waste. Also, if you use the bevel modifier, turn off hardened normals, which fails for cylinders and similar situations like in these corners. Again, minimizing the gap. And to reiterate, by starting from a plane, I made sure the origin sits on the surface level. It doesn't matter where your object is on the z-axis, but it matters where the origin is in relation to the surface. And when I talk about the surface level, I mean the upwards-facing polygons. DECALmachine will look for them, and create an alpha mask based on that. To create a decal, make sure your object is selected, and press the Create Simple Decal button. When done, the decal will appear on top of your source geometry, and will be selected. It will also appear in the Instant Decal library in the panel. Instant decals are complete decals, and are ready to use. But they are really only meant as an intermediary step, to fine-tune your settings and for testing. We will add them later to other decal libraries. Throwing the decal on a sphere is an excellent way to test it. Working great. When you reinsert the decal from the Instant Decal library, you'll notice that it's much smaller than before. That's because decal size depends on its texture resolution. The decal that was inserted right on top of the source geometry was just scaled up accordingly. If I now lower the texture size, and create another decal from the same geometry, the decal object size will also be smaller, once you reset the scale. To create a subset decal, all you have to do, is create one or multiple additional objects. Then, select all your objects, and make sure the object representing the surface is selected last, making it the active object. Notice that with 2 or more objects selected, the button will tell you what kind of decal will be created. Test the decal again. If you did everything correctly, you'll see the subset part is properly masked out, and a second material can be applied to it. Again, everything is working great. If you look closely, at the auto-matched and shrink-wrapped decals, you shouldn't be able to tell where a decal begins and ends. The transition should be perfect, at least in Eevee. If you compare that to the same decal, but floating and not applied to an object, you can see that there is actually considerable aliasing in the alpha map. To get rid of this, you can optionally enable anti-aliasing for alpha, at the cost of additional baking time. You can also increase the quality of the anti-aliasing by setting it to 4, instead of 2, which will also increase the render time. And significantly, for texture resolutions above 256. Personally, I don't use anti-aliasing on the alpha map, because it makes no difference on the end result. The ambient occlusion bake, that is part of the process, can be a bit noisy at 256 samples, so you can increase that to 512 for really smooth results. You can also increase its contrast. There are also the curvature settings you can play with if you want. The effect is more subtle, but it lightens the positive edges and darkens the negative ones. The distance property you can basically always leave at 1. It essentially sets up the height map's upper and lower level, and ensures height map bakes are consistent across different decals. If you would set it to 0, your height map would always max out, no matter the actual depth that is baked. And if your decals are consistently higher than 1 unit, which is unlikely if you start with a basic plane, you could set it above 1. You can also leave the alpha limit to active, enabled at all times. It means, only the top-facing polygons on the surface level of the active object should be used for the alpha map. Limit to boundary can be useful in some cases, but should probably be disabled most of the time. Let me build another decal to explain what it does. If you have a detail, with multiple extrusions on the surface level like this, the alpha should cover all upwards-facing polygons, not just those on the outside borders. That's why it's disabled by default. However, if you would enable this setting, the faces in the center would not be masked out, which may be useful in some cases. Only the selected faces have now contributed to the transparency. There's another property called flatten normals, and I suggest you leave this enabled. To demonstrate what it does, I will disable it, and I need to inspect the bakes to do that as well. I'm removing the bevel modifier on this object and remove the sharp edges set earlier as well. I'm now adding bevels on the mesh level. Without the sharp edges, that bordered the bevel geometry earlier, you can see how the bevel now influences the shading in the flat areas. That is undesired, because even though the flat areas will be masked out, it means the shading on the bevel does not transition into the flat surface optimally. This in turn means, the decal will not blend into the surface perfectly, once applied and projected. Watch the R and G values, at the top right, while I pick the color in the flat area. Both should remain at 128 until I actually hit the bevel. But they don't. The normals tilt inwards, in areas that should be flat. If I now bake this again with the flatten normals option enabled, the normals will be perfect. And by the way, this also produces better results than using sharps at the borders of bevels. Although admittedly, this is probably stuff for the perfectionists among you. Still, it's just a checkbox, and there's no performance hit, so the perfect normals cost you nothing. Removing those two decals, which I accidentally deleted between edits. You can also change the thumbnail appearance, by selecting a different color. For more drastic changes, you need to modify the thumbnail scene in the templates file in DECALmachine's resources folder. In addition to simple and subset decals, you can also create your own panel decals. As before, I suggest you start from a plane. Build it like this, and make sure it aligns with the world x-axis. Also, for a decal like this, which separates two sides, definitely have the Material 2 map enabled. Testing a panel decal is not quite as easy as testing the others. But it comes down to just applying your new panel decal material to an existing panel decal. You may need to unhide your decal materials first in the DECALmachine panel. And there it is. The new panel decal material on the existing panel geometry. And by the way, if you ever see blurry panel decals like this in Eevee, just UV stretch them. You can add subsets to panel decals as well, simply by adding additional objects. Make sure to make the main panel object, representing the surface, the active object when you run decal creation. By default, the separation of the material and Material 2 components in the panel decal material will just be straight and in the center. You have full control over this separation, however, by marking edges as seams. It's going to be easier to see without the ambient occlusion. I'm now adding the seam edges. And there it is. And if you are wondering why the Material 2 mask is optional, it's for decals like the following. This one doesn't create a material separation. In DECALmachine 1.8, you can now finally also create info decals directly in Blender. In fact, there are 3 different approaches to do so. You can create them from images, from text and fonts, as well as from geometry. If you have images to use, just load them. PNG is preferred, but JPEG may work as well, depends on the image. Once loaded, you can pick an image to create a decal from. You can choose to crop, which I'm disabling now. And you can also set the padding. Then, just hit the Create button, as before. To compare, I'm doing it again, this time with crop enabled. Some decal creators tend to use massive amounts of transparency in their images. While DECALmachine has no problem with this, it's just unnecessary, especially if you consider projecting those decals. This is a huge image, so you may actually need a higher amount of padding, to prevent bleeding. I've talked about this before, in the video about the Adjust tool. You can actually see some bleeding at the bottom here. It's also a very big image, and the 1 pixel padding is not enough it seems. You can always get rid of it by using closest color interpolation, of course. The second method to create info decals is by selecting a font, and entering a text. You can load fonts in the same way I've loaded images before. And you can place line breaks in your text by typing \n. If you do so, you can choose to align the text left, center or right. You have control over foreground and background colors, as well as transparency for each of them. Depending on the font you've chosen, you may also need to adjust the offset. Finally, the third way to create info decals is from geometry. Using basic modeling tools, you can essentially do the same things you can do in vector drawing software. It gets even more powerful in combination with text objects. This will be baked, like simple, subset or panel decals, so select a resolution. And just like that, it's an image. The text object is of course editable. You can add some padding to these as well. Once you have created your decals, and you are happy with them, you may want to add them to one of your libraries. As of right now, your new decals are only in the Instant Decal library, which is meant to be a temporary storage. Note that as soon as a decal is selected, the Add to Library section in the Decal Creation panel appears. The scale, rotation and location of the decal will be reset when it's added to a library. So it doesn't matter from where you add it or how it is aligned. An index will always be added to the front, to ensure proper, consistent sorting in the order of creation. Press the Add Decal to Library button, and it will appear in the library you have chosen. Notice the object and material names. It works the same for every other decal. For simple and subset decals, you should make sure to set the parallax amount as you want it, before you add it to your library. For panel decals, if you choose to create your own, you should also create a library, just for panel decals. And don't forget to mark it as slice. Make sure the panel library is selected, and add the decal. We can see the decals in the Pie menu, but just as with the example panel decals, we don't need this library in the Pie menu either. And if you now change a panel decal material with the Adjust tool, you will find the new ones can be selected as well. Note that you can add multiple decals to the same library in one go. But unless you want them all to share a name, it's best to use none at all. This covers everything there is to know about decal creation in version 1.8. The only remaining thing to do is removing the instant decals. And it works exactly the same as removing any other decals. You can enable decal remove mode directly from the panel, followed by removing the current instant decal using the red button, or picking individual decals from the library. Don't forget to disable decal remove mode again once you are done.